Our goal this week is to understand the general nature of logical arguments. So let's begin with trying to understand overall what critical thinking is when it pertains to this course. So critical thinking is a logical evaluation of arguments. Now that term is used very loosely in everyday life. People will say things like, let me engage in some critical thought about the issue, or I've been thinking critically about something. But in those instances, a lot of times they don't mean specifically the logical evaluation of arguments. So when we talk about critical thinking in this course, we're referring to the actual skill of logically evaluating arguments. So overall, logic itself is the science that evaluates arguments. Logic teaches us to develop a system of methods and principles to use as criteria for evaluating the arguments of others and to guide us in constructing arguments of our own. So in this course, we are only concerned with logical arguments. The term argument is used in a lot of different ways in everyday discourse, and we're not concerned with that sort of use of the term argument itself. So with that in mind, let's define exactly what an argument is. So logically, an argument is a group of statements where one or more of those statements is intended to provide support for or reasons to believe one of the others. So for a series of statements to qualify as a logical argument, and that's the only kind of argument we're concerned with in this course, there has to be this relationship between something that's being offered as evidence and then something that's being supported by the evidence. Now, the support may not be good. It could be a poorly constructed argument or a very weak argument. But if there is that relationship between some kind of evidence being offered and something being supported by that evidence, then we are technically dealing with a logical argument. Now, later in the course, we will learn specific techniques and criteria to evaluate whether arguments are actually good or bad. But right now, our goal is simply to understand the basic parts of arguments themselves. So, just to clarify here, in everyday discourse, the term argument can often refer to a verbal dispute. Many verbal disputes do not meet the above criteria and are therefore not logical arguments. So, for example, let's say I go out in my backyard and my neighbor is in his backyard. And I say to him, you're a terrible neighbor because you let your dog bark all night. And so he says, no, I'm not a terrible neighbor. Letting my dog bark is okay. And I say, no, you're a terrible neighbor because, once again, you let your dog bark all night. So that could go on indefinitely. And so the question I would have at this point is, have I offered a logical argument? And so technically, by our definition, that was a logical argument. It may not be a particularly compelling argument, but it is a logical argument because I offered evidence for some particular claim. The claim is that he's a terrible neighbor, and the reason I gave for that is because he lets his dog bark all night. So that's the kind of relationship that I'm talking about here. In order for a passage to qualify as a logical argument, there has to be the relationship between evidence being supported, evidence being offered, and then the statement that's being supported by the evidence. Now, if I would have gone out in my backyard and said to my neighbor, you suck, and he says, no, you suck, and I say, no, you suck even worse, and he says, no, you suck even worse, that wouldn't be a logical argument because there wasn't any evidence being offered. Now, if I said you suck because you let your dog bark all night, then that technically qualifies as a logical argument. Once again, maybe not a particularly compelling argument, but nevertheless, it would qualify as a logical argument. Okay, so the statements that provide the support in an argument are referred to as the premises. Premise would be singular, so if you just have one statement that's providing the support, that's a premise. If you have more than one, then you would refer to those as the premises. The statement or statements that are supported are referred to as the conclusion. So if you have that sort of relationship, statements that are providing the support and a statement or statements that are being supported, you have a logical argument. So here is a simple logical argument. All dogs are mammals. All mammals are things that have hair. Therefore, all dogs are things that have hair. Now, this is about as simple as it gets with an argument, and really, honestly, only philosophers and logicians talk this way. Most people in everyday life don't talk so formally or construct arguments in such a formal and obvious way. But for our purpose here, we're just trying to understand the parts of an argument and their relationship. So in this simple argument, all dogs are mammals and all mammals are things that have hair. Those two statements are the premises. They're the statements that are being offered as evidence. And therefore, all dogs are things that have hair. That's the conclusion. That's the statement that's being supported by the two premises. So hopefully that gives you an idea of sort of the relationship between premises and conclusions. Just that relationship of statements being offered in support of something, and then that statement that's being supported. So one skill that we have to acquire here early on is being able to identify premises and conclusions in arguments. It's a necessary skill in order to critique and evaluate arguments. If you don't know where premises are, if you don't know where the conclusion is, then you have no way of evaluating the relationship between those two things. So this is something that takes a little practice, and it's a skill that one can become better at over time. But what I can do is sort of point you in the right direction, and then as you begin to think about this more, I think you'll become much better at understanding how to identify premises and conclusions in arguments. So the key way to do it is to look for indicator words. In other words, there are words that indicate in arguments whether you're dealing with premises, those statements that are being offered as evidence, or conclusions, those statements that are being supported by the evidence. So some typical conclusion indicators are words like therefore, accordingly, entails that, thus, it follows, for example, would be another conclusion indicator. So if you see words like that, then you know that probably what follows after that word is going to be a conclusion. So in the previous argument that we looked at, let me just go back one slide here. Our conclusion down here, therefore all dogs are things that have hair. There's a conclusion indicator word there, therefore. And so we know that that has to be the conclusion in that argument. Okay, so some typical premise indicators are words like since, in that, seeing that, because of, as evidenced by, right? So phrases of that nature indicate that you're dealing with premises. So they indicate that we're looking at the evidence that's being offered in favor of some claim. So what I want you to do as beginning logic students here is to get into the mindset that when I first look at a passage and I'm evaluating it as a logical argument, where are my premises? Where is the conclusion? That's the first step in becoming a critical thinker. Being able to identify premises, being able to identify conclusions. Okay, so this outline, this graphic here just basically gives us sort of a pictorial view of the typical structure of premises and conclusions. Premises, once again, just I want to reiterate this so this sort of is burned into our brain for the duration of the course. Premises are the claimed evidence. They are the statements that do the supporting in an argument. And conclusions, these are the statements that are being supported by the premises. They follow from the evidence. Okay, so recognizing arguments. So we need to be able to understand the difference between an argument versus a non-argument, because there are lots of things in everyday discourse and everyday discussion that appear to be arguments when in fact they're not arguments. And so all we're concerned with in logic and in critical thinking is evaluating genuine logical arguments. So it's a skill that we have to acquire. We have to be able to know that we're actually dealing with an argument. So once again, at least one statement must claim to present evidence or reasons. That's our premise or premises. And the alleged evidence must claim to support something. So one way to become good at identifying arguments versus non-arguments is to be aware of some of the common types of non-arguments or non-inferential passages. So here's a list of really common basic non-arguments. Warning, a piece of advice, a statement of belief or opinion, a report, a loosely associated statement or series of statements, expository passages, and explanations. None of these things qualify as arguments, meaning that none of these things will typically have that relationship of some evidence being offered in favor of some kind of claim. So what I want to do is go through each of these types of non-inferential passages or non-arguments, look at an example of each, and then hopefully give us a better understanding of the nature of arguments themselves. Okay, so let's start with warnings. A warning is a form of expression that's intended to put someone on guard against a dangerous or detrimental situation. So it's not an argument technically. No one's offering evidence that there's a dangerous or detrimental situation. They're simply warning a particular individual of a dangerous or detrimental situation. So if somebody yells, "Watch out," or "Don't give anyone your password," right? Those are examples of warnings, but they're technically not logical arguments because in the first case, no one has offered any evidence for why you should watch out. And in the second case, no one has offered any evidence in favor of why you shouldn't give anyone your password. Now, you could turn those into arguments if you said, don't give anyone your password because if your account is hacked, it could have financial impact on you. Right. So in that case, we'd be dealing with a logical argument because we offered some evidence in favor of the claim that we shouldn't give anyone our password. But warnings themselves are not logical arguments. Pieces of advice. So a piece of advice is a form of expression that makes a recommendation about some future decision or course of conduct. So here's an example. You should keep a few things in mind before buying a used car. Test drive the car at varying speeds and conditions. Examine the oil in the crankcase. Ask to see service records. And if possible, have the engine and powertrain checked by a mechanic. So this is an example of a passage that if you're not careful, it could appear to be an argument at first glance. But if we look at it in a little more careful way, we see that there really isn't any evidence being offered in favor of any of these claims. The first statement, you should keep a few things in mind before buying a used car. They're just telling you, hey, this is what you should do. They're not telling you why you should do it. They're not telling you the reasons behind keeping these things in mind. It's simply a statement telling you that you should keep these things in mind when you're buying a used car. And then after that, it's just a list of the things that you should keep in mind. So it's probably pretty good advice to do these things when you're buying a used car, but it's not an argument in favor of any of these particular things. Now you could turn it into an argument once again, as we could in the example of warnings. You could say you should keep a few things in mind before buying a used car because buying a used car is a significant investment and people are oftentimes duped into buying cars that are not of the value that they pay. Right? And so they've offered evidence in that case if it were modified in that form, and we see a premise indicator word because right? So we know that some evidence is being offered in that case. But in the form that it's in now on this slide, that wouldn't qualify as a logical argument. Statements of belief or opinion. So a statement of belief or opinion is an expression about what someone happens to believe or think about something. It's simply a statement of one's thoughts, essentially. So for example, I believe that aliens have never visited Earth. There's no evidence being offered that aliens haven't visited Earth. There's no inferential relationship between premise and conclusion. It's just a statement of belief. Now, it could be turned into an argument. For example, I believe that aliens have never visited Earth because the nearest star to ours is 4 light years away. So the argument there is essentially that aliens have never visited Earth because it's just too far to travel from one solar system to another. Now maybe aliens have been to Earth, maybe they haven't. I know that people have a lot of opinions about those sorts of things. But unless some evidence is offered, a simple statement of belief about something is not a logical argument. And then, by the way, just to reiterate, let's go back here to statements of belief or opinion. A lot of things that we would call arguments in everyday life are usually statements of belief or opinion, with people just emotionally and vociferously stating those particular beliefs or opinion. So the example I started with about my neighbor, when I said you could go out and say I could have gone out and said to my neighbor, "You suck," and then he says, "No, you suck," and I say, "You suck." That's just a statement of belief or opinion in unison. We're both doing exactly the same thing, and so that wouldn't be an argument because no evidence is being offered. So no matter how complicated the belief is, or no matter how lengthy the belief or opinion is, it's still not an argument unless some evidence is being offered. Reports. So a report consists of a group of statements that convey information about some topic or event. So, for example, 30 civilians were killed today in Ukraine. So there's no argument being made there, obviously. There's no relationship between evidence and the thing that's being support for the evidence. It's just a statement of fact about something that's occurred. So reports are pretty easily distinguished from arguments. They're not too tricky to separate from the category of things that are logical arguments. Loosely associated statements. So loosely associated statements may be about the same general subject, but they lack a claim that one of them is proved by the others. So for example, lying is wrong, stealing is wrong, cheating is wrong. So this is just a list of moral propositions or claims about morality. So a lot of us might believe that lying is wrong, stealing is wrong, cheating is wrong, and so on. But there's no argument for any of those things being made here. There's no evidence for the claim that lying is wrong. There's no evidence for the claim that stealing is wrong, and no evidence for the claim that cheating is wrong. I mean, you could turn each of those statements into an argument. You could say lying is wrong because it causes detrimental impact on society. Now, that's not a particularly compelling argument, but it is an argument because some evidence is being offered in favor of that particular claim. So these statements are all related to one another. They're loosely associated, obviously, but just because there's an association between statements in a particular passage, it doesn't make it a logical argument. There has to be that relationship between some kind of evidence that's being offered and something that follows from that evidence or is being supported by the evidence. Expository passages. An expository passage is a kind of discourse that begins with a topic sentence followed by one or more sentences that develop the topic sentence. If the objective is not to prove the topic sentence but only to expand on it or elaborate it, I got a typo there, then there is no argument. So I got an example here on the next slide. So there are three familiar states of matter: solid, liquid, and gas. Solid objects ordinarily maintain their shape and volume regardless of their location. A liquid occupies a definite volume. but assumes the shape of the occupied portion of its container. A gas maintains neither shape nor volume. It expands to fill completely whatever container it's in. So, at first glance, one might think that there's some evidence being offered here that there are three familiar states of matter. But if you look at it more carefully, there's this statement that there are three familiar states of matter, but then examples are just given. Solid, liquid, and gas, right, and then an example of each one of those. There's no evidence being offered that those are the only states of matter. There's no systematic argument that's intended to show that there are actually three. There are just three examples given after the three familiar states have been stated. So expository passages can be very tricky. And if the expository passage is written in a way to where the thesis statement is trying to be proven in the body of the actual passage, then technically that passage could qualify as an argument. So once again, sometimes there'll be sort of some gray areas here where it's difficult to actually discern or distinguish whether or not you're actually looking at an argument or non-argument. But in those cases, always go back to seeing if you can find your premise and conclusion indicators, and then see if there's an actual logical or inferential relationship between those statements. In other words, when I say inferential, does one of those statements follow from the others, or does some of those statements, more than one, follow from the others? If that's the case, then you have a logical argument. Okay, and so then we have explanations. An explanation is an expression that purports to shed light on some event or phenomenon. The event or phenomenon in question is usually accepted as a matter of fact. So for example, the sky appears blue from the Earth's surface because light rays from the sun are scattered by particles in the atmosphere. Now this one's tricky because you do see the premise indicator because. This word right down here. The sky appears blue from the Earth's surface because light rays from the sun are scattered by particles in the atmosphere. So at this point, given that this is a well-established scientific truth, this wouldn't qualify technically as a logical argument for our purposes. If this were an argument, if this passage were being offered when scientists were first beginning to explore why the sky appears blue, then it could be construed as an argument in that context. But in this case, what's going on is the because is trying to explain why light rays, why the sky appears to be blue, and it's because light rays from the sun are scattered by particles in the atmosphere. It's answering a why question. It's not an attempt to prove that something is the case. So scientific explanations generally are not viewed as arguments. They are viewed as attempts to explain why a particular event or a particular thing has occurred. And then finally, we have conditional statements. Conditional means if-then. So conditional statements or if-then statements by themselves are not arguments. So if I said something like, if you wash my car, then I'll give you $100. That statement itself is not an argument. It could be construed or reconstructed into an argument. So for example, if I said, if you wash my car, then I give you $100, then we stated that you washed my car, and then I said it follows that I gave you $100. That's an argument because there's a relationship between evidence. If you wash my car, then I give you $100. You wash my car, that's the evidence. Those are the premises. And then the conclusion is that you got $100. Now that may not be a particularly good argument. I could lie to you and so on and not pay you. I understand that. But by its structure, essentially, it's an argument because some evidence is offered in some form for a particular claim. So another example I have here is if professional football incites violence in the home, then we should reconsider giving widespread approval to the sport. That's not an argument. That's simply an if-then statement. It can be turned into an argument, as I did with the argument about washing my car. We could say if professional football incites violence in the home, then we should reconsider giving widespread approval to the sport. And then we would add another premise there. We'd add more evidence and say professional football incites violence because here's an example, here's an example, here's an example. Violent sports cause violent behavior. And all those things may be false, but I'm just giving you an example of how we could turn this into an argument. So if we gave additional evidence that football actually incites violence, then we could draw the conclusion that we should perhaps reconsider giving widespread approval to the sport. That would be a fairly complex argument to construct. I'm leaving quite a few premises out there, but you get the idea that this particular passage could be turned into an argument if we added more statements as evidence. Okay, so that's it for 1.1 and 1.2.